So years and years ago, I recorded the oral histories of two child survivors, Max Arian and Freddie. And I wrote about these two then adult child survivors in Children with a Star. But they were not finished with me. The history of their post-war lives continued to gnaw at me. Freddie's was part of a bitter post-war national controversy, while Max's, as you'll hear, was not. And so I researched the history of Jewish child survivors in the Netherlands to understand the larger context of Freddie and Max's life stories. Happily, we have Max here to speak with us for himself. Alas, Freddie died some years ago, and I must speak for him. So let me clarify how this session will roll. I will speak for no more than 25 minutes to give the larger historical frame and to follow Freddie's life in that frame. And then we will turn to Max. I will take the floor again to offer some observations on the contrast between these children's post-war experiences. And then it will be your turn, the learners, the listeners, to ask questions of Max or of me and to say whatever you wish to say. So with that, let's begin. Freddie was 3 years old when the Germans invaded the Netherlands. He was nearly 5 when a family friend took him from his home in Amsterdam to hide at her house in Hoorn in February 1942. His parents were to come a day or two later, but they never arrived. They were deported and killed in Auschwitz. The house where Freddie was hidden also was raided, but he was saved by a Catholic family across the street with many, many children who swooped him up into a game of hide and seek, and he was put in a cupboard. Freddie subsequently was moved about 15 times, but the original family with whom he hid, his so-called foster parents, kept in contact with him wherever he went. After liberation, they came to fetch me from my last address and took me home, he said. Freddie lived with that foster family, and he went to school, and he waited for his parents to return. I expected them to come back, reasonable or not, and even notwithstanding the fact that people told me that probably my parents were dead, I expected my parents to come back. I expected everybody to come back, and no one came. It was Freddie's historical fate to be one of 3,512 Jewish children hidden in the Netherlands who were registered as war foster children, oorlogspleegkinderen, when the war was over. The question that arose was, to whom did they now belong? Now, this problem had begun to worry rescuers long before the end of the war. Led by Gesine van der Molen, a severely Calvinist, strong-willed lawyer, they drafted a law pertaining to war foster children, which called for the establishment of a special guardian commission called OPK. OPK was to be granted guardianship of all war foster children, quote, whose parents or guardians have not registered at the OPK office within 1 month of the publication of this law. Let me read that for you. What they meant was concentration camp survivors. The commission would be composed of members of the child rescue groups that had developed during the German occupation of the Netherlands. The authors of this law clearly believed that it was they and not any Jewish community authority or civil child welfare bureaucracy. It was they who knew what was best for the children, because it was they who knew intimately the conditions under which the youngsters had lived for the past 3 years, and because it was they who had risked their lives for the children. Indeed, the child rescue workers who wrote the bill, and Gesine van der Molen in particular, did not think that the hidden children's family members, or in certain cases, even the parents themselves, were so competent to act in the children's best interests as they themselves were. As the proposed law clearly stated, and I'm quoting now, parents whose children are under the guardianship of OPK will have their parental authority returned to them by the judge when they are physically, spiritually, and socially capable of exercising that authority over their children. Most particularly, the authors wanted to erase the differentiation between Jewish and Christian Dutch citizens. They refused, they said, to continue to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews as the Germans had. Their goal, and I quote, was to come to a true melting together. But by refusing to distinguish, they also refused to differentiate. Treating all Dutch citizens equally, they ignored the special assaults their Jewish compatriots had endured and consequently their particular needs. The Netherlands was liberated on May 8, 1945, and a few days later, the OPK Commission held a meeting to establish policy guidelines for the reunification of children with their biological families. To prevent disturbing or shocking changes, to maintain a stable environment for the child, in short, for the child's own good, close relatives were not to be given the current address of the children they sought to find. Parents' requests had to be judged individually on a case-by-case basis. At the same time, a newly reconstituted Jewish communal authority, the Jewish Coordinating Committee, or JCC, established its own Jewish Guardianship Association, which they called Ezrat Hayeled, to help the child. The positions of the JCC and OPK were in direct contradiction. The JCC wanted Jewish orphans to be returned to the authority of Jewish communal bodies, as would have been the case before the war, when Protestants looked after Protestants, Catholics after Catholics, and Jews after Jews. The JCC wanted to rebuild the Jewish community. The OPK insisted that the children remain where they were. They may or may not be returned to their parents. They certainly should not be given to family members, and on no condition were they to be turned over to the authority of the Jewish community. Both parties were convinced that the program they advocated was in the best interest of the child. In fact, of course, while the programs they advocated may or may not have been in the best interest of the child, they certainly were in the best interest of their own ideologies. Despite the attempts of the JCC to enlist the sympathy of the government, the OPK legislation became law by royal decree in August 1945. The OPK, now an officially established body with 25 members, of whom 10 were Jews, gained guardianship of the orphans. The law triggered a bitter 4-year dispute that centered around the claims of the Jewish community versus those of OPK and the Gentile foster parents. In an article published shortly thereafter in what would later be Max's newspaper, De Groene Amsterdammer, the author, Caroline Eitje, pleaded for the return of the orphans to the Jewish community. She understood that many foster parents loved the Jewish children they had raised, but she pointed out the children had been entrusted to them, and what is entrusted must be returned. The issue, she argued, was straightforward. What community can, with impunity, give away its younger generation, those who embody the future? It would be an enormous disaster for that small remnant of Dutch Jews, which consists mainly of older men and women. That is the reason why the Jewish community must demand her younger sons and daughters, and why they cannot make any concession on this point. In an interview, Gesine van der Molen presented her position. Our commission considers the issue a Dutch affair, which must be solved in a national Dutch manner. Her plan, therefore, was to act in accordance with what the parents would have wanted. And I quote from her, "The wish of the parents comes first. This always will be respected, but often this is not known, and then we have to act according to probabilities." The weakness of van der Molen's plan, however reasonable it may have appeared, is that the placement of the child depended on someone's whose interpretation, how, of the wishes of the parents. Van der Molen sought to divine how the parents would have brought up their children by assessing their Jewishness, but her scale reflected what Calvinists thought Jews should do to be good Jews, not how Jews saw themselves. Earnest and well-meaning but perfectly ridiculous investigations were conducted to determine the degree of Jewish observance and therefore the degree of Jewish identity and therefore the presumed child rearing practices and education plans of the parents for their children. Despite the efforts of the Jewish minority on the commission to educate the Gentile majority about the meaning and importance of culture as well as customs, the latter remained ignorant and oblivious. The majority argued, for instance, that the parents were not really Jewish because they did not keep a kosher home or because they had worked on Saturdays. Perhaps the parents had married in synagogue to satisfy their own parents, and maybe they belonged to the community merely out of habit. In case after case, the majority denied what they called a positive Jewish environment in the home of the child's parents and recommended that the child remain with the foster parents. The judges invariably accepted their opinions and indeed sometimes went farther. In one instance, a judge ruled that even though the father had attended synagogue regularly and the parents kept a kosher home, they obviously did not have a Jewish way of life because their little girl had eaten non-kosher cookies in the home of a neighbor. In another case, the judge ignored the testimony of 3 women survivors of Auschwitz who attested to the wishes of little Hanni Murpurgo's mother. Before her death, she had asked them to make sure her daughter received a Jewish education. The judge found, however, that the woman was incapable of thinking logically. Holding fast to their concept of the best interest of the child and to their conviction that to separate a child from wartime foster parents would cause grave psychological harm, OPK supported the explicit political goal of assimilation and an implicit religious agenda of saving souls. The JCC and the Jews on the commission understood this very well. Frustrated, they walked out, which finally prompted the government to consider the wishes of its Jewish citizens on this issue. OPK was ordered to cooperate with Ezrat HaYeled, and the Jewish members of OPK returned to the commission. Court battles continued to be waged, but the Jewish minority now had a more secure legal foundation for their case. It was so secure, in fact, that it changed Freddie Mock's life irrevocably. My foster parents were asked whether they would mind if, for a Jewish holiday, I would be in Jewish surroundings, to which my foster parents said, "Oh no, of course not, fine. He's a Jewish child," and so on. So I went to several parties. One day, I went to a Hanukkah party, and they, my foster parents, came to fetch me. But it turned out it was an Aliyah Bet group, a group that organized undocumented immigration to Palestine. And my foster parents came to fetch me, but they did not get me. So I became a legal affair and a court affair, and in the end, I was put into a Jewish orphanage. The court took the decision that I should go to that orphanage and stay there until I was 21, which I did. We have heard about the adults' positions on the subject of the best interest of the Oorlogspleegkind, but we have heard very little from the children themselves. If this were the only history to be told, if this were the only way to think about and write history, then the controversy over the war foster children in the Netherlands would tell us a great deal about how adults use children to foster their own projects, whatever those projects may be, and would lay bare the divisions within Dutch society, which, as it happens, applies to other countries in Europe as well after the war. But the history of the very public fight by adults over the war foster children will not tell us anything about the young people themselves. It is they, and only they, who can tell us what it meant to have been in hiding, to have waited, if they were old enough to remember, for their parents, to have been disappointed, as Freddie was, or to have been reunited with that memory in the flesh. And here we turn to you, Max, who was nearly 3.5 when he was taken from Amsterdam to be hidden in the south of the Netherlands. Dearest Max, can you explain how this came about?
Oh yes, I can. My father was already deported because he fought with the Dutch fascists, and he. You could show the marriage photo. Oh, do you do? Of my mother and my father and the 2 nieces. This is the first photo. Yeah, there they are. These are my father, Arnold Arian, and my mother, Rebecca Witteboom, and Lidie and Mary Luike. These were my 2 female cousins who didn't survive the war, but they were the bridesmaids of my parents. My father fought with the fascists in the Jewish quarter, and he was arrested very early and transported with the first deportation, July 1942, to Auschwitz, and died or was killed there. And then my mother, of course, she didn't hear of my father. She didn't want to go that way too, so she escaped three times. First, she was talked out of the police office, and she could go away. The second time, she, perhaps we can see the second photo. That's me with my three nieces, Mary and Lydie, and little Beppy. She was only 1 year old. I tell about Mary and Lydie because it's so impressive for myself. But we didn't know. We only know I didn't know anything. But my grandmother and my mother heard that they escaped to Switzerland. So that's what they hoped, that this family, their mother Tony, the eldest sister of my mother, and David, her husband, and the two little girls would survive anyhow. They had more chance to survive than we really had. But my mother, she was taken, she escaped from the Hollandse Schouwburg, where the Jews were assembled. She escaped and she could flee through the garden of another. But then she was taken again, she was arrested, if you can call it arrest, again, and she was a special case, a special punishment case, and she was beaten, and they thought that she was part of an illegal network, which was not really true. I think my father didn't tell her about his illegal work, not to make it more difficult for her. So she thought, no, this is the end for me. I go to the East too. And then the only thing she could do was smuggle a little letter to my uncle, make the child go away, make the child that he gets away. And the child, that was me. And my uncle could do that because he knew one of the leaders of one of those groups that brought children, Jewish children, in hiding. That was Theo de Bruin. His real name was Job Woordman, but his illegal name was Theo de Bruin. So Theo de Bruin said, and that's amazing, I think, bring the little boy to the Hollandse Schouwburg, opposite of the Hollandse Schouwburg, where all the Jews were assembled, and also my mother. There is a crash, and from this crash, they organized to bring the children away to Frisia or to Limburg. And so my uncle, he knew him very well, Theo de Bruin, and he did it, and it was all right. And so I was brought just in the lions. This is the crash, and that was really the mouth of the lion. I was brought there to be saved from there, and I like that very much. That the resistance was so good organized that they could bring you there and save you, and that the Germans wouldn't have an ID, because the Germans believed in their own administration. And when I was not administered as I didn't exist for them. So I was saved, brought to Limburg, lived there with my foster family that I love very much. Still, I do. Here I am in hiding. This is in Schaatsberg. You can see this miner's house. And then I came with my foster family. We have also a photo, I think from just after the war, where I am with my family. My Oom Al, I said Uncle Al. Fien, my foster sister, that's me. That's Ed, that's my foster brother. And Tante Lies, that's my foster mother. I look a little bit stern, but that's all right. I felt very fine. And if I may say so, for me, if my mother wouldn't have come back after the war, of course, I would love to have been with my foster family, where I was very, very happy. And that is for many children. Some of them I know said that their war only started after liberation, that they were very well in hiding, but afterwards they were separated from those people. And I want to say, that's just because that's perhaps not clear. Gesine van der Molen wanted the Jewish children to be Christian and to be with the foster families. But she was a very, very tiny minority of the resistance people. I knew very well later, much later, Piet Meerburg, who was leader of one of those groups. And Piet Meerburg was very angry on her, and he hated her. And he felt trapped into this whole thing, this law of the parents that couldn't be as parents. And so I think Gesine van der Molen was a very small minority, but she was a strong woman. That's indeed true. But in fact, I don't think so many problems. We know about the problems, and there were legal problems, but many people didn't make any problem. Like my foster parents did not make any problem, and the OPK didn't make any problem. I was with my mother. I found a little report by Lau Maziel, who was a famous resistance fighter herself, and she said, "Oh, Max is good with his mother." Perhaps I'll tell how my mother came in Heerlen. My mother.
Could you first tell what the cover story was?
The cover story was very simple, like many, many children. The cover story was that I was an orphan from Rotterdam. And perhaps nobody believed it, but all right. I think many people understood that I was a Jewish child, but many people didn't understand it. And they only heard it after the war. And my little friend from next door, he said, "You cannot be a Jew. All the Jews are dead." And so it was. No, I was not, but I was not dead.
But yes, do tell the story of how you were reunited, the story of your foster father.
Yeah, my mother was also, that was really a miracle, but the Jewish resistance could save her. She was already in the train to Westerbork, the camp. But they organized my mother to get out of the train. She could just walk out of the train. This, I don't know how you call it, a bracelet, a thing around an armband with GR, Joodse Raad, Jewish Council. And she could hide in another train.
Armband.
An armband, yes, all right.
And
they brought her also to Limburg, but to another place. But my mother got a letter of my foster mother, and my foster mother got the letter of my mother. So they knew that my mother was still alive, and my mother would come 5th of May of 1945. That's more or less by accident, I think. It's Liberation Day, but that was not yet Liberation Day. But Holland was liberated in that time, in May 1945. And she would come, and my foster father told the story because he was standing for the window above. I think he was shaving himself, and he looked and he saw a car coming. There were not many cars at the time. I was playing in the street with the other kids, and I had my things there, and my foster father said later, my mother came out of the car, and she snapped me out of this crowd of children. So he knew immediately that she was my mother, and also we were very much alike. So although I always had said, "You don't give me away to a strange woman," but they prepared me more or less that my mother could be alive, and still they did it. They couldn't. They were not able not to give me to her, because they were so empathic, and they saw this woman finding her little son, they couldn't say, no, you can't get him. They were very, very sad. And especially my foster sister, who was very lovely to me, and I sleep with her in the bed, and she was very, very sad. But still, they did it, and they did it in a very good way. And there's a little anecdote that I only understood much later. They said to my mother, come you back. You in English can mean plural or singular, but in Dutch, you is singular. So they used the plural way, jullie. They said, please come as soon as you both come as soon as is possible. And I think they included my mother immediately. And they also included my grandmother, because my grandmother came from a camp at Regenstad with the train, and she came also to Limburg. That was just by chance. And we went there, and my foster father said, oh, why shouldn't we go? We can look if she's there. And my mother didn't recognize my grandmother, but because she was now, she had always been very fat, and she was very slim then. But my mother recognized the dress, because she had made it herself. And then my grandmother also was invited by my foster family, and they feeded her, and they're lovely to her. And so everybody, and that's strange that it's a little bit an anticlimax, you can say, because it has always been that way, that my mother and my grandmother loved my foster parents and foster sister and brother, and my foster family loved them. And they were yeah, this is a happy end. But and it's not even an end, because still this day, although of course my foster father and my foster mother died quite long ago, and my foster sister died 3 years ago, I'm still with the family. And a little, it says Max here, but a little Max was called after me, who was born 2 years ago. And I was delighted by that. And so that we're still in this contact, although with Corona, that was difficult. And my mother and my grandmother, they managed to build a life. It was difficult, especially in the beginning. It was very, very difficult. But my grandmother has a very, very positive character. She has had so many tragedies in her life, so she still could enjoy life. And I think, of course, that she had this little grandson. We lived together, my mother, my grandmother, and I. That it makes also her life worthwhile. But I think she, not only because of that, she always had this positive way of living, and you can see how she likes to. They had the commerce in fruit, and they. Of course, it was very difficult in the beginning, but they did it all right. So I'm very happy that, and you can see that you can get along. Oh no, I didn't tell that all the holidays, I would go, every holiday, I would go to Heerlen, to Limburg. It's quite far away. And I think already with 8 years old, they put me on the train alone and asked a lady who was there in the train to look a little bit after me, and then would go to my foster family. And all the holidays I was there. So I had both families and both places and both backgrounds, and I could. I think it's a very good and nice thing to have.
Absolutely. Are there more? Do you want to explain this photo?
This other?
Do you want to?
Yeah, no, tell me.
Just do you want to explain this photo from the Groene?
Oh, this is my story. Yes, in 1983, so even 10 years before you would write your book, I wrote my own story. You must begin somewhere. So I began with my own story to tell the story of the NV group, who was the illegal group that of Theo de Bruin. And yes, you know, just after the war, you didn't know. You knew your foster parents and perhaps the place where you had been before. That was in the same street. And the story about the razzia that had been there in 1944. There was a potato commercial who was how we call fout, a traitor. So the people there were taken, and but they didn't came to me. And my foster sister went with me in the cornfield, and we were hiding for the day. And no, I survived anyhow. And yeah. So this is how it came about. My little niece survived too, also in hiding, but the other two they escaped. They escaped to Switzerland, but they never made it. So their mother, Tante Tony, and my uncle David, and Lydia and Mary, they were killed, and we could never really think about it. You could never even feel what happened to them. If you try to, it's too terrible to think about it. These little girls of 7 and 9 years old, how can it that they are killed, and all those millions, 100,000 millions of other kids and other people. That's too bad. I think we came to the conclusion that we cannot feel this all. It's too big and it's too bad. And even when I, as a journalist, went into the whole story, I never could swallow it. It's just impossible.
Max, could you reflect for us about your ever-developing understanding of the importance of your foster family to you and your importance to them?
I don't so much my importance to them. Listen, they didn't make a difference between people, and they did it already before, because Protestants and Catholics were not friends in that time, but they had Protestant friends, very good friends, and they didn't make a difference. Also, there were my foster father worked in the mine, and there were also Russian how you call it, prisoners of war working there, and he would also give food to them. They didn't make a difference between the Russians and the Dutch, and perhaps not even between the Germans and the Dutch. And they didn't make with Jews, and I didn't tell this. They did a lot of things which were wonderful. I never said father and mother to them. I said
Rifki,
Uncle Alex.
I lost the sound. Could you put yours on? You don't want to? Then don't.
Is my sound all right?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Yes. Do you hear me? You hear me now?
I do hear you.
No, I tell it alone only to you. They had already these principles, not making a difference between people, and they did it also after the war. And when Roman Catholicism it's a nice.
Would help.
No. Roman Catholicism looks nice with the processions and the communions and things. So as a child, I liked it, and it said I also wanted to be there. So they said little children shouldn't go in a church. If you are 18 years old, you should choose what you should be. And I later only realized how wonderful this was. And this is the grenade shell that they gave me in 1945. It says in memory of your foster parents, May 1945, I think. And it, it's a nice story, perhaps. I have 8 grandchildren. I'm very fond of them and glad with them. And my youngest grandson, he wanted me to tell about the war in his classroom. But when I talked with him, I found that he thought about the war, like fighting and things and shooting. And there's not much shooting in my story, but happily. But I thought about his grenade shell. And it's in our room, in our living room. So I brought it, and I had something warlike to show them. But it's also moving because it's written on it like I could ever forget them, but I never forget them, of course, and they are so very, very important in my life. But they are important in my life with everything they did and how they did it, and also that they didn't want me to be thankful. But also my mother and my grandmother, they were the same. They were as good as they were. So it's a good. It's very close to each other. They never asked me to choose at all. They just gave me both families, both parents, both. That's also possible.
So let me pick up from there to express my observations about the two. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
True, please.
So Freddie and Max had obviously had very different experiences after the war, but it seems to me that certain patterns emerge from their histories. And it's just what Max is talking about now, that the structure of either or choices, either the foster parents or the parents, either the foster parents or the extended family, either the foster parents or the Jewish community, that structure of either or choices was a contradiction of the real needs of the child. Freddie was attracted to the Jewish community and attached to his foster family. The Aliyah Bet group that kidnapped him in 1947 urged him to emigrate to Palestine. His foster parents didn't want him to leave them or the country. So I had this mixed feeling of, on one hand, nice that finally people spoke my own language, used my own words, could understand my own jokes, which was really important. So I didn't want to go. But on the other hand, I was very much attracted by the whole thing of Judaism and Jewish atmosphere. So I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that I wanted to stay with my foster family, but on the other hand, I didn't want to stay with that family because I knew also that it was not home. It was a different social atmosphere, a different social background. In the end, Freddie knew, as he said, that he was, quote, a stranger in the house. I knew I belonged somewhere else, but the somewhere else didn't exist anymore. Now you, Max, by contrast, you were not faced with an either or decision at the time or later. And notwithstanding all the challenges that you faced and your mother and grandmother faced, you negotiated the transition with greater ease. So it seems to me that through the history of children like Freddie and Max, we see that the oorlogspleegkind controversy was over the children, but not about them. There were two issues at stake for the adults. The first was the ever unresolved problem of balancing the collective versus the individual good. What was best for the Jewish community was best for the Jewish child. What was best for the New Netherlands was best for the foster children. The second was the equally eternal problem of the hegemony of the dominant culture. And think about it. The children were called war foster children, not war orphans. They were seen from the perspective of the Gentiles who took them in, not from their own situation of loss and devastation. This history also reveals a pattern that pertains to the children. One way or another, each child integrated his or her pre-war and wartime experiences with his or her post-war life. It turned out impossible to create a divide in 1945 between the then and the now. Both were part of the child and found expression in their adult lives. And that's what you've just taught us, Max.